Okay, so it's 4 past, so I think we might just as well start. Thank you all for being here this evening. My name is Natalie Nguyen from Monash University, and I will be hosting today's Making Public History Zoom webinar on refugee lives, memories, and communities. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Making Public History is a seminar series offered jointly by the Monash University History Program, the History Council of Victoria, and the Old Treasury Building. Each event aims to explore issues and approaches in making public histories. The seminars are open to anyone interested in the creation and impact of history in contemporary society. I'm joined today by Making Public History's team, Al Thompson from Monash University, Alicia Cereto, who will be handling Q&As, Margie Anderson from the Old Treasury Building, and Susie Propsky from Deakin University. And of course, our three wonderful speakers that I will be introducing in a little while. I'm very pleased that you have all joined us this evening. So this is how the evening will be structured. So unlike a Zoom meeting, only the presenters and hosts will be seen and heard. This will be a 45-minute in-conversation event, followed by 35 minutes of Q&A. So each speaker will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes, with 5 minutes of Q&A afterwards. If you have questions for the presenters, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can be anonymous if you wish. If you have any technical issues, use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. If a presenter's internet connection is slow or disrupted, they will continue with voice only. We are recording this webinar tonight, and the recording will be available in a few days. Of course, please keep your questions polite and respectful. And I will now introduce our first speaker. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ruth Balint. Ruth is Associate Professor of History at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. Her books include Destination Elsewhere, Displaced Persons and Their Quest to Leave Europe after 1945, Cornell University Press, and with Julie Kalman, Smuggled, An Illegal History of Journeys to Australia, NewSouth Publishing. She will present her paper on borders and the family. Thank you, Ruth. Over to you.
Thank you. I'll just try and share my screen. Okay, now that's not the format we want, is it? How does that look? Is that good? Okay, thank you, everyone. I'd just like to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Bedigal Nation, and I extend my respect to elders past and present, and sovereignty was never ceded. I've called this talk Borders and the Family, and it's really made me think today when I've been preparing for this, what do I mean by borders and the family? What does it mean to speak of borders, this kind of instrument of immigration and security in a sense, and the family? And I guess I became interested in this topic via a very circuitous route that began with my PhD about 20 years ago, when I encountered the traditional Indonesian fishermen doing jail time in northwest Australia, initially for the crime of traditional fishing or illegal fishing, actually, and later for people smuggling. And I learned while making a film and then writing a PhD that these fishermen had fished in these waters and traded marine delicacies via the China market going back centuries. And in the course of that research, I developed the notion of mare nullius, the myth of the unoccupied sea, that has enabled a familiar story of dispossession, in this case maritime dispossession, in ways similar to terra nullius on land. And this was when I began to think about the border as a place where the narrative of the nation state and the power of the centre is most contested. People who live on the peripheries, often ethnic minorities, usually have a very different relationship to the nation than those living in its centre. It is on the margins where the nation state is often most exposed to cracks and fissures, and thus often the place most securitised. This, I think, led me to an interest in immigration, to thinking about the way immigration as a regime articulates a sense of territoriality and maps the nation in specific ways, often in racialized and ethnic ways. I've since written 2 books addressing this, one on the history of people smuggling in Australia with Julie Kalman, and one on the experience of Europe's displaced peoples after World War II in their efforts to find refuge away from the ruins of post-war Europe and the Iron Curtain. In both of those books, I was most interested in the everyday encounters that refugees have with borders and the agencies that police them. But I was still avoiding any anything to do with my own family's history. Indeed, I had avoided any kind of research into Holocaust-related histories. The Holocaust felt like a border I could not cross. However, 2 things happened that gradually led me to tentatively cross into my own Holocaust zone of research by way of thinking about how Jewish families, including my own, sought routes of resistance. Both of those things involve my 2 grandmothers. And I should just say here that that Destination Elsewhere book was actually about non-Jewish displaced persons. A visit to the International Tracing Service in Germany in relation to the research for my book Destination Elsewhere was the occasion for my maternal grandmother to ask me to help trace her brother, who had disappeared after being called up for forced labour by the Third Reich in the Second World War. To trace someone, you needed a name, but more importantly, to find out the fate of someone, you needed the number assigned to them by the SS. I found 2 numbers I thought might have been his, and traced the journey of these 2 numbers through the carceral nightmare that was the concentration camp system. I came to the realization that I would never uncover exactly which of these 2 numbers referred to my great uncle. Both were murdered in Buchenwald. But this lesson was to be formative. For anyone who's researched the Arlsen archive, indeed pretty much any archive in my experience, one of the things you will have noticed is the experience of finding multiple dead ends, of finding too few traces. Carolyn Steedman has written of the archive that it only gives us stories caught halfway through, the middle of things, discontinuities. Unlike the fiction writer, we cannot invent the endings for our subjects, and they all too often disappear. The second thing that happened was that after my paternal grandparents, Evie and Imra, died, I inherited a big green garbage bag crammed with old recipes cut out from newspapers and women's magazines dating back to the late 1930s and 1940s. At first glance, the contents looked like rubbish. The paper clippings were yellowed with age, and when I picked a few out at random, the recipes were hardly relevant to my own life. nor did I associate them much with my grandmother's cooking. I hauled the bag out to the recycling bin, but then I stopped. There might be a reason to keep this bag, although I wasn't quite sure yet what that might be. So I threw it into the boot of my car, took it home, and stashed it at the back of my wardrobe. A few years later, I came across it again, and rifling through it, discovered right at the bottom Evie's personal cookbook, an old exercise book, bursting at the seams with clippings, shopping lists, letters, and all kinds of ephemera tied together with cardboard and this piece of string. My paternal grandparents, Evie and Imra, had applied for a visa to Australia straight after the Anschluss, when the Nazis marched into next door Vienna on 12th of March 1938. They were hardly alone. As Suzanne Rutland describes, the Australian Jewish Welfare Society, formed only a year before to meet the needs of refugees, received 1,700 desperate letters from European Jews in a single week following the Anschluss, asking for assistance to get an Australian entry permit. Miraculously, my grandparents were successful. That's their landing permit there. As Klaus Neumann writes, people like my grandparents were able to come precisely because they did not identify as refugees, but rather as migrants with the required landing permit money. In their case, £500, an enormous sum given to them by Imra's father and the rest of the family. But even for those that managed to raise these exorbitant funds, this did not guarantee entry to Australia at this time, as restrictions tightened across the world to Jews trying to leave Europe. And as this newspaper article shows, the Department of the Interior had received over 40,000 applications by 1939 and could pick out the best types to fill industries where there were labour shortages. My grandparents immediately set about trying to bring their other family members to Australia, in particular their parents and siblings. Evie had a sister, Anne, married with 2 young children and a brother. Imra had his own sister, Clara, who was also married. My grandparents took any jobs they could get to raise the landing fees for their family members. And I found traces of the attempts of my grandparents to um, to to bring their family from Europe during this period in the official archives, the National Archives, namely as it's known, the Form 40, submitted to the Australian Department of the Interior. There are over 8,000 Form 40s in the National Archive received by 1939, most of them for whole families, covering around 40,000 people. And I'm talking about since Hitler took power until 1939. So my grandparents were participating in a specific moment in history at the cusp of war, as literally thousands of families were submitting Form 40s for their loved ones trapped in Germany, Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other countries in Eastern Europe. My grandparents, like so many others, were unsuccessful in getting their families out of Hungary, and their siblings and nephews and nieces were all murdered in the death camps. But as I looked through the cookbook, returning now to the cookbook, I found something astounding. Folded into small squares and tucked into the back pages of Evie's cookbook were letters written in tiny script on rice paper thin paper from her family. Paper thin rice paper from her family during the war. Her cookbook had become her place of safekeeping for things that were precious, probably looked at often in private moments for the rest of her life. These letters detailed simple family moments, the births and birthdays of children, the health of parents, fears about the war. Like home movies, these were of significance only within the intimate circle of the family. But to me as a historian, these letters were also a stark reminder of the terrible limitations of the official document and the bureaucratic stamp of rejection on family applications. These letters also charted one family's attempt to remain connected at a time when Jewish families were torn apart by the borders of war and immigration. They are an example of the informal networks created by refugees around the globe to circumvent the rigid borders of communication during war. As contact with enemy countries became prohibited under the Trading with Enemy Act, and families were trapped in ghettos and concentration camps. But the fact is that some families were able to continue communicating, often until final moments. Among my grandparents' papers are the Red Cross telegrams, which from 1940 became one of the only means of communication between Australia and Nazi Europe. The Australian government agreed to allow the Red Cross to transmit 25 words of, quote, harmless family news. And the Red Cross in Australia sent its first messages in November 1940. By the 30th of June 1947, it had sent over 110,000 messages. Meanwhile, the International Committee of the Red Cross transmitted 10 million civilian messages by 1943 and close to 24 million by 1947. Oh, sorry. Now I have embarked on a new project with my colleague Jan Lunacek, exploring how Jewish families separated between Australia and Europe created new underground networks that resisted the borders of the war and bureaucratic indifference. We want to find out what happened to their dead and their living. Carolyn Steedman has written elsewhere, "The archive is one of those spaces where the dead are but do not see you. We have to take account of them." End quote. In this project, we want to take account of them, using the archive alongside other forms of evidence that will give a proper accounting of the refugee family experience. We also hope, I think, to counter the negative images of refugees that are so prevalent in our own times. History is a project rooted in the present. As historians, we are often drawn to subjects or events in the past that speaks to the concerns of our own contemporary times. In recent years, we have witnessed the voices of anti-migrant politicians grow louder and far-right populist regimes grow stronger, as phenomena such as Donald Trump and Brexit overturn the previous, though brief-lived, status quo of internationalism and globalism that occurred after the Holocaust. The anti-refugee rhetoric of today is in many ways reminiscent of the late 1930s, when Western governments expressed concern that masses of refugees, particularly Jews, would swamp economies and societies. This kind of rhetoric only gets a foothold when refugees and their stories remain anonymous, remain a number, remain foreign, separated by the borders erected to silence their histories and their familiarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for this wonderful paper and this very moving look into your family history. Alicia will now handle the Q&As.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks so much, Ruth. I'm going to invite our audience to ask questions by using the Q&A button on the bottom menu bar of your screen. And I should let you know that Ruth won't be with us at the group Q&A at the end. So now's your chance if you have a question. And I thought while people are thinking of their questions, Ruth, I was really struck by the way that you talked about that tension of being pulled towards your own family history, but sort of resisting it at the same time. And I wonder if you could tell us some more about that.
Yeah, so it's true that I had always even danced around the subject of never touching it, never quite coming close. And as I said in my paper, I think I began to recognize that the only way to for me, I guess, to think through a more family-centered history of refugees was to start with my own story. Partly because I had access to the kind of evidence that I needed, but also because it gave me a more intimate sense of just what is at stake, I think, in these kinds of histories. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you're an insider in that sense of you're understanding it in a different way to other researchers, perhaps.
Yeah.
And how is researching your own family in the archive different to or not different to researching other families in the archive?
That's a good question. I have found I've now started to research other families, and I think it just gives you I'm not sure whether it's actually all that different, except for that kind of emotional connection. But it's not so. I mean, I don't know how to answer that question, actually. I don't think it's so different. I think it's just, I guess, just given me a different angle. And I really, just giving this talk made me think a little bit more about how to approach, or what that approach has given me, I guess, what that journey has meant to my own research, that's kind of followed parallel with the story of my own, of researching my own family, and turning that into something academic. I think that's a tricky border to cross sometimes, and I'm still trying to learn how to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've got a question in the chat from Ariadne, who asks, since your investigation into your own family history, have you found greater commonalities between all migrants, Jewish and non-Jewish, or have you found situational circumstances intrinsic to migrant history, or perhaps both?
Yes, I think we always, as historians, are very mindful that time and place must be taken into account when we're looking at these stories. We can't just see all refugee stories as following a similar pattern. So I think that's a great question, and there are both commonalities and differences, certainly, and it's almost I think it's really important to make sure that we're very mindful of the historical context of different stories around refugees. I don't think we can simply homogenize that experience. So that situational is a very good word to use in that respect.
Yeah. And Kathleen has a question for you, asking, how do you think the specific refugee or forced migration experience might lend a specific meaning to things like letters, which may also be sent and treasured by the families of temporary travellers or voluntary migrants? And do they bear more emotion when the borders they crossed were so complete or abrupt or unyielding?
So I'm just reading that question myself as well.
Yes.
And of course, I mean, for me, the letters that I found tucked in my grandmother's cookbook are really the only traces left of people that have basically just wiped off. There's no belongings, there's no objects, there's very few photographs, and these letters just seem to be something that are really important mementos and traces of these people's lives. And they are incredibly, they're treasures. That's a really good word to use. And I think they do bear more emotion. And there's something about the letter nowadays when we don't send letters anymore. There's something about that particular form object that is just has its own beauty and has its own value. The handwriting, the paper, it's something tangible about a person that we wouldn't get in our world today with email. So yeah, I do think they have a very specific meaning, an important meaning.
And I think the way that you described it as, the thinnest of paper and the tiny handwriting, and I think in the picture you shared with us, you can see how important it was to use every part of the paper, and whether it was about, cost or getting as much on the piece of paper as they could.
Cost. So they do have a lot of meaning, and also if we look a little bit outside the letter itself, how these letters crossed borders at a time when it was really hard to get letters out actually, and the routes these letters followed, it often took months via different, in the case of my grandparents, letters had to first go to the United States from their family to get around to Melbourne in Australia in order to pass all these kind of other barriers around wartime communication. So these letters are very, precious. And I think refugees today too, trying to communicate from war zones or into war zones, experience the same kind of barriers.
And a final question for you from Georgina asking, have you cooked any of the recipes?
Yes, of course. We have definitely cooked some of these recipes. And what was interesting about the cookbook was that it was also key to thinking about my grandmother's own journey of assimilation at that time, as it was called, both resisting assimilation by keeping her own recipes, but also reaching out to neighbours who would give her recipes. She had collected recipes from Australians around her, trying to make sense of the Australian cuisine, and you could kind of really see that conflict going on there in the cookbook itself.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
And I think, as Georgina has said in that question, another or a different way to connect and to to feel that experience for you. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruth. I'm going to pass back to Natalie now.
Okay, thank you, Alicia, and thank you again to Ruth. I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, so Chi Vu. Chi is a Vietnamese-born Australian writer and theatre maker. She collaborates with diverse artists to create performances that span genres such as the post-colonial Gothic, magic realism, and comedy. Chi's theatre works include Coloured Aliens, The Dead Twin, A Story of Soil, Ben Chung, and Vietnam, A Psychic Guide. Her novella, Angulimar, A Gothic Tale, is published by Giaramondo. She will present her paper on This Language is Beginning to Invent. Okay, over to you, Chi. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt with the screen share. Can you see my screen okay? Yep, great. So yeah, writing from another linguistic self. And my name is Chi Vu, or Vu Thị Mỹ Chi in Vietnamese. I'm coming from Wadawurrung country in Geelong. In my talk, writing from another linguistic self, I answer the question of how my background as a Vietnamese child refugee has influenced my creative output through talking about 3 of my plays, Bánh Chưng, Story of Soil, Bánh Chưng, and Colored Aliens. And so what do I mean by another linguistic self, or bilingualism? First of all, there's this big misbelief about bilingualism, often held by bilinguals themselves, that to be a true bilingual, you have to be as good as 2 monolinguals in one body. But linguist Francois Grosjean argues that bilinguals have a unique linguistic configuration. Sorry, that's moved over. And that this is due to them being in a state of constant linguistic relativity. Note that linguists tend to use the terms bilingual and multilingual, but literary studies scholars tend to use the term translingual. So in this talk, I use both terms interchangeably. So with my first play, A Story of Soil, I wrote, which I wrote in the late 1990s. It was produced at Footscray Community Art Centre with actor Hai Ha Lee in her first professional role, and the renowned first-generation actor and director Tam Phan. At the time, the Vietnamese community had only been in Australia for about 20 years, mostly as refugees or family members of refugees who were reunited through the family reunion program. And so the 2 linguistic communities, the English-speaking Australian mainstream and the Vietnamese Australian community, were much wider apart than they are now. And this distance was a problem for me because I'd grown up in Australia and my background was that of a child refugee. My family had left Vietnam by boat. We escaped in '78 and were on a UNHCR refugee island off Malaysia for a year. And so it was 1979 by the time we got to Melbourne. Anyway, I'd grown up in Australia and I wanted to bring these 2 linguistic communities together because they're both a part of me. In order for me to do that, I decided to use code switching in my first play, which is dialogue that shifts between the 2 languages. Most of the characters in A Story of Soil were Vietnamese Australian, and so they would code switch between the 2 languages. In many ways, this strategy helped first-generation actors like Tam Phan claim a greater presence on stage, because when they delivered a monologue, the sections that were in Vietnamese helped them to be more grounded and more present in the delivery of their lines. And this is because the values of a culture are embedded in the language. So it wasn't necessarily a matter of fluency, because an actor can learn lines to the point of fluency. But rather it was also the fact that some cultural concepts and values are much more prominent in Vietnamese than in English, and vice versa. The next play I want to talk about, second work I want to talk about, does the opposite of bringing 2 linguistic communities together. So Bánh Chưng, an installation performance, is very much about fragmentation. Around this time, I became much more interested in how the Vietnamese community was part of a diaspora. There were several iterations of Bánh Chưng, and this one was from 2011, the photos that you can see, and at Dance House in Carlton. So the Vietnamese community are dispersed around the world as refugees and had been resettled in countries like France, United States, Canada, and Australia. And they would have family members still in Vietnam as well. They were both geographically and linguistically dispersed. So to me, that fragmentation is a significant legacy of having been a refugee. How can I represent the lived experience of being in the diaspora? For the Banchung installation, I split the audience up so they could enter the installation space either alone or with up to 3 other people at a time. And their entry was staggered, 15 minutes apart, even though the whole experience was an hour long for each audience member. Each person would watch the same actor perform the same action, such as pouring tea or sweeping some dried leaves. But how they interpreted that action was contingent on the particular audio story they were listening to and where they were in the space, whether the story was about mythical ancient Vietnam or during the Tet Offensive in Hue, 1968, or a kitchen somewhere overseas, reminiscing about what's been lost. So that spatial configuration helped me convey the sense of fragmentation of being in the Vietnamese diaspora. The third talk, the third play I want to talk about is inspired by Australian history. Coloured Aliens is the title of my play, and it comes from official documents at the time of Australia's Federation, which described non-white migrants as coloured aliens. And there you can see in the quote from John Watson in 1901, how businesses conducted by Chinese, Syrians, and other coloured aliens had taken over whole streets in Sydney. The quote speaks to me not only of how there have been migrants of colour in Australia since white settlement, but also that this rhetoric of the alien or the other has been a defining feature of how white Australia saw itself, in contrast to 60,000 years of Aboriginal culture and language and caring for country. So the key idea for me in Coloured Aliens is the juxtaposition of who is an alien and who is an Australian. I wondered if this context affects how former refugees like me are perceived and understood by the wider population. And also, how does Australia's racial history affect how plays written by non-white playwrights are received? The director, Beng O, proposed that we cast the characters cross-racially, and I agreed. So in the images you see, the Vietnamese Australian female playwright is played by a white actor, Annie Lumsden, and her Anglo-Celtic boyfriend was played by an Asian actor, John Mark Desegano. And that works really well, that cross-racial casting worked really well to bring out the sense of irony and also enhance the comedy as well. So togetherness, apart, and juxtaposition are the 3 approaches I've taken so far to explore stories of Vietnamese Australians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chi, for this really interesting discussion about being a refugee, theatre and language. Over to you, Alicia.
Thank you, Natalie. Thanks so much, Chi. Again, if anyone has any questions, pop them in the Q&A. And while you're thinking of that, I get to ask a question. So I'm intrigued by the way that you're calling it sort of fragmentation, but you create these works that have such multi-layered, so many layers to them. You're allowing people to physically experience something, visual, audio. It seems like, in that physical experience that the audience is experiencing that dislocation that you're talking about.
Yeah, so the first iteration of Bunchung was just a traditional format. So I had the actors, including me, I was acting on stage, and the audience were in the auditorium, being one audience, experiencing one story. And, you know, so that was the kind of format of A Story of Soil as well. And then, and I was happy with that version, but it didn't quite, the form did not quite say diaspora to me, because we are looking at, you know, the one story rather than the simultaneity of multiple stories, and being both here and over there and, you know, elsewhere at the same time, which is how you feel when, you know, you've got cousins all around the world. And so I guess your family story is, dispersed as well. And so I kind of thought about how to reshape it as that installation performance, and recorded the same script as audio stories. So there are 4 audio stories. And we had audience members say that so that one of the kind of stories was the massacres and the siege during Tet 68, and they were listening to that story and they're just watching the performer sweep some dried leaves, and they interpreted the sweeping of the dried leaves as dead bodies, right? But someone who is watching the same action at the start of the work, which is, you know, this light comedy kind of slapstick story from ancient, you know, mythical Vietnam, it's just sweeping of the leaves, right? And to me, that that kind of multiple layers of interpretation is what it feels like when you're living in diaspora and, you know, between languages and across languages.
Yes, the way you talked about code switching, where you're, you know, you're the, you know, the refugee, you're the student, you're the child of parents, you know, who may not speak the language or who may, but you're sort of jumping into more roles, perhaps.
And you have to navigate where you're standing to look at certain things. So you're aware that, you're aware that there's, you know, for any event, so say Story of Soil, for any event, you could do a Vietnamese interpretation of what's going on, or you could do a mainstream Australian interpretation of what's going on. And when you're talking about like, you know, family dynamics, expectations of, you know, family interactions, hierarchy, then that becomes very different, you know, especially back then, in terms of what is expected of a young person in a Vietnamese family.
And I think we're all struck by the Bunchung, the way that you put that together. And there's a question here from Kathleen who says, that was amazing. In your installation, did the audience get a sense of fragmentation of their own experience from that of others?
Great question.
Yeah,
yes.
It's great.
Yes. So, yes, definitely. So people were watching other people respond to the action, because once you leave the first station, then you're at the second station and you know exactly what the new people coming in are listening to. And you can see from their response, you know, it's always in sequence. It's not random. You can see from their responses that, they're enjoying the lighthearted comedy of the first story. But here you are at the second story, like feeling the trauma of, you know, like the heavy story of Tet 68. And so you are aware that the people ahead of you know that you're listening to something they've heard already. So by the time you get to the end, you're like, oh my gosh, all these stories are existing simultaneously at the same time. And I had people who wouldn't, after their stories finished, they didn't want to leave the space, and they just sat there and watched the whole kind of thing continually move. Yeah, for like an hour, which is like the length of the
That's huge.
So, and then you had we actually cooked the buncheon cake in the space, so the smell would kind of waft throughout the space. And you know, you could also taste the food, that it's a traditional food for Lunar New Year, Vietnamese Lunar New Year. And so that sense of being kind of nurtured and fed and held while you're going through these, I guess, these changes in like, because they're discrete stories, these changes in where you're positioned historically and geographically as well. But the common thing was the food. Yeah.
And you really, that multi-sensory. So there was smells and taste as well as all the others that we've talked about.
Yeah.
Al's got a question for you, saying that togetherness, separation, and apart are the three metaphors you use to shape the plays and represent the Vietnamese Australian experience. But if you were producing a play now, as third generations are developing new identities and relationships, what metaphor might you use to structure a new play?
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure. That's a big question. I guess the closest like, rather than come up with a new artistic concept on the spot,
no pressure.
The closest I can point to is maybe Coloured Aliens, where naturalism, we escape from naturalism. I mean, Buncheon is not naturalistic either. And the cross-racial casting is, so to see a male Asian body kind of say words like, words that normally you only hear coming from a white male. It's the kind of the the disconnect between what you see and what you hear, and it's a bit more kind of confronting, and so you can't kind of say, that is a Vietnamese experience, right? It makes it a little bit more universal in some ways, in terms of how who is perceiving whom to be alien.
Yes, absolutely. So another way of sort of challenging the audience to think about the stories that are being presented.
There is a short video if people, or you can just go on my website and watch some of the videos of the two actors interacting, with the cross-racial casting. It's it's striking the way that that impacts.
Thank you. I might share that in the chat for everyone afterwards. But thank you so much for answering all of the questions, and I'll pass back to Natalie.
Okay, thank you again, Chi, and thanks, Alicia. Okay, so it is my great pleasure to present our last speaker, Shameran Slewa-Younan. Shameran is Associate Professor in Mental Health at the School of Medicine, Western Sydney University, and holds an honorary appointment at the Centre for Mental Health, University of Melbourne. She has been practicing as a, I've got the introduction on my screen. Just hold on a minute. She has been practicing as a cross-cultural bilingual psychologist since 2001 and currently practices in Fairfield, Sydney. Her focus has been on providing optimal psychological care for resettling refugees from an Assyrian background, offering psychological assessment and treatment using a cognitive behavioral approach informed from a bilingual and bicultural perspective. She will present her paper on mental health promotion for refugee and other culturally and/or linguistically diverse migrant populations, lessons from the field. Thank you, Shameran.
Thank you, Natalie, and apologies for kind of jumping in. I just wanted to make sure I had the right slides up at the time. Okay, so I'd like to also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. And to say that I am coming from Darug lands because I'm coming from southwestern Sydney at the moment. I appreciate we're all over the country at the moment. So let me talk a little bit initially about myself, because I think when Natalie first approached me, she said, oh, you know, she tried to explain the seminar and what led into doing this work. So I probably will start with that. So I'm a proud Assyrian Australian. I'm also the eldest of three girls. I was born in Fairfield, which is in southwestern Sydney. And although at the time I was looking the other day at photos, I was looking at my kindergarten photo, it was like me in a sea of blonde children. Now is one of the most, you know, diverse LGAs in Australia, I think, if not, I mean, it's definitely New South Wales, if not all of Australia. And I continue to practice there as a psychologist, as Natalie was talking about, and do research there. So my father, who is pictured there, he came out to Australia in 1969. He was an industrial chemist, so he had trained as he graduated as an industrial chemist, was working in north of Iraq, and at the time was working in a British petroleum company. And as he was kind of getting to know people, he heard about all of the joys of Australia, and he loved two things: swimming and drinking beer. And when he found out that those are the two things that you can do a lot of in Australia, he immediately kind of found a way of coming over. And he had some family here, so they came over here. And when he came to Australia, he continued to work in that field for quite a while. He's not anymore, but he was certainly doing that for a while. So he was working in Shell refinery for a while. Before he came to Australia, he also went to visit Syria because he had some family in Syria. And when he went there, he actually met my mother, who was there. And then shortly after, in about 1971, my mother came out and they got married here in Australia. So when I was growing up, for myself and also for my two sisters, my parents were very focused on making sure that we had a typical kind of childhood, in the sense that, I mean, I grew up in the 70s, so it was a lot of outdoor play. And here is my beloved dog, Rusty. So I did a lot of playing outside with him. But at the same time, they were very focused on stressing the importance of maintaining our traditions and our languages. And in fact, when I was about 7 years old, I was lucky enough to go back to both Syria and Iraq with my mother. And that's pictured actually in a field, and I'm holding one of those famed Damascus roses. So I was, you know, lucky enough to go back there. When my father came to Australia, shortly afterwards, he was able to bring his siblings and his parents, but that wasn't the case for my mother. So my mother was one of 7 daughters, and she had a younger brother. And when she came to Australia, she had 2 younger siblings, so she brought them over, and her mother. But her elder siblings, which were all girls, were married at the time and had children. So they chose to stay in Syria. Well, not necessarily always a choice, but there was, you know, they ended up staying there. And they stayed there for a long time. And it was only most of them that in 2011, that civil war that broke out, where a lot of them had to be forced to basically flee. A majority of them have since resettled in Australia. Some unfortunately passed, and some are in the US. Now, I was working as a psychologist with Assyrian-speaking migrants and refugees for many years prior to the events of 2011. But it was really those experiences of my maternal family, because I was working very closely with mum, trying to, you know, do the paperwork to bring them over and learning of stories. And also the events that were happening soon afterwards in North Iraq, where Assyrians, amongst other kind of minority groups, were being persecuted by the terrorist group ISIS. That really cemented to me the need to work with my community and other kind of more migrant and refugee communities to better meet their needs in terms of mental health needs. It always had been clear to me that in my community, mental illness stigma was very prevalent. And I know that mental illness stigma has been prevalent in most communities. But one of the things that I often would notice was that people would exhaust so many different pathways before they made their way to seeing me as a psychologist. What I mean by that is they would go off and have all of these medical investigations to try and find an explanation for why they were feeling the way they were before they actually ended up seeing a psychologist. So that really that was really what spurred the interest in understanding why that was, you know. So basically my area of research, which is mental health literacy, and I'll talk about that soon. I thought I'd just quickly kind of talk a little bit about Assyrians, because I mean, probably there are people who know, but not necessarily everyone. So Assyrians, I'll just briefly go through this. Assyrians are people who have a culture that dates back more than 6,000 years. We are Semitic people, and we're from indigenous to Mesopotamia, which today kind of spreads across the countries of Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey. We are distinct ethnically from Arabs and Jews. And if you were to kind of look at basically, you know, a whole variety of things, one of the things that's quite prominent is that Assyrians, although we do continue to speak our language, which is a derivative of ancient Aramaic, there's a lot of us who don't, unfortunately, can read and write. And that comes out of persecution as well, because we weren't allowed to practice the reading and writing back home. So for almost 2,000 years, since we kind of embraced Christianity and established the church, the Assyrians have lived in the Middle East as a religious and language minority group. And because of that, they have been persecuted in many kind of ways, in a number of events, basically. And so one of the things that's difficult for us now to understand is, well, you know, what are our population estimates? We're not quite sure. Roughly, they think it's around about 4 million worldwide. And I guess this all stems from the fact that we've had this kind of displacement, mass kind of movement of our people over many years in that kind of very peaks and troughs type of thing. So one of the things that I was looking at the other day was quite, you know, I suppose interesting to me, was that prior to 2003, when the US went into Iraq, there was an estimated 1.4 million Assyrians living in Iraq. There's around about 300,000 now living in Iraq. So they've all fled and had to go different places. So this kind of peak and trough, you know, we saw coincides often with periods of conflict. So the periods in the 70s, the 80s, 2003, and most recently in the 2014, where kind of ISIS started persecuting the minority groups. So on this slide is a series of different types of, I suppose, experiences that the Assyrian community unfortunately has experienced. There's been, and this is just in the last 100 years. So there was the targeted persecution by the Ottomans in 1915, where along with Assyrians, the Greeks and the Armenians were persecuted and murdered. There's an rough kind of idea that around about 750,000 Assyrians were killed at that time. Another very significant event for our community is what we call Semele Massacre, which is the name of a town in North Iraq, where in August 1933, the newly formed Iraqi soldiers and newly formed Iraqi government soldiers went into that town and murdered something like 3,000 Assyrian men, women, and children. And of course, like I said, most recently in 2014, you know, ISIS came on to most people's kind of radar. We began hearing about it. And there was this quite systematic attack of the minority groups along, you know, so Assyrians being one of them, the Yazidis being the other, where they were kidnapping, murdering, and persecuting them, you know, demanding money for even existing in their own homes and so on. But alongside all of that kind of human toll, another thing that people probably are aware of, but one that really impacted in the community was the well-planned attack of kind of historical artifacts and churches for our community. And that, to this day, I still see or hear about it and the impact it had on our community. So today Assyrians find themselves really, in a struggle for a number of reasons. She would use the word fragmentation. Fragmentation is very applicable to us. We are, as I said, for the first time, there are more Assyrians living in diaspora than there are in our native lands. And that really has an impact because we are struggling to try and maintain our language, trying to maintain our traditions. But at the same time, effectively being able to resettle in the new communities that we find ourselves in. And so it has quite a significant impact. They are Assyrians, especially the ones that, the new arrivals that come in, are constantly trying to balance this with the need to, resettle, to find, their place in the new country, to effectively find employment and so on. And all the while, they're also often still very much worried about family members that are still living in, countries where, either in their homelands or, as asylum seekers elsewhere, the pressing needs of providing financial assistance and so on. So for all of these factors, I suppose it's probably not very surprising that trauma presents as a big thing in kind of my psychological practice. I certainly see a lot of it, a lot of multi-generational trauma. I see a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and grief. So this kind of really spurred my area of interest in terms of research. So when, as I said to you right at the start, when people come to me in clinical practice, it's often because they've gone to these specialists, they've had all of these various different scans, they've been trying to find a reason for why they feel so poorly, and it's really not because of those things, and it is actually because they are sad, they are traumatized, they are, struggling with all of the kind of things that they have experienced. And so initially, when I first started doing this research, it was really just looking at documenting and measuring the mental health profile of those who were seeking treatment versus those who weren't seeking treatment. So I was interested in understanding, was there a difference between them? And in fact, I didn't really find that. And in some cases, those who were not seeking treatment were actually measuring, with different scales at more levels of high severity. So that kind of really then led into this, then I started thinking about this whole concept of mental health literacy. And so mental health literacy is defined as knowledge and beliefs about mental health disorders, which aids their recognition, management, and prevention. And it has a whole range of aspects to it. But, one of them is the ability to recognize a mental illness, through to having the attitudes that would promote active help seeking. So mental illness stigma, for example, would be the exact opposite. That often will be a barrier to seeking help. Now, Australia has been a world leader in mental health literacy research ever since, the first survey was conducted in 1995 by Professor Jorm, who was, based at the time, I think at, ANU, recently at Melbourne University. But when I first started doing this work, very little had been done with refugee or migrant groups. So certainly very little had been published. And so over the last 8 years, my students and I have really started to develop a very strong evidence base to demonstrate that within refugee groups or other migrant groups, there is quite a distinct difference between the way that they engage in mental health services and the way that they view mental illnesses as well. So for example, one of the studies we did where we were presenting, they were resettled Iraqi refugees, we were presenting them with a vignette. So that's one of the ways you can do it. You present a clinical vignette, but of course it's written in a very layman's terms. And you ask them, what do you think is wrong in this this character here? Or you say, what's going on with this character? And what we found was that, you know, about 14% actually said that that was potentially a mental illness. And when a similar kind of vignette, not quite the same because we had to make it culturally relevant, but when a similar vignette was presented to the general Australian population, you know, it was well over double that they were recognising it as a mental illness. So it became quite clear that recognition was not, you know, was not as ideal as possible. And also when we looked at, for example, how best to seek help, or where were the sources of help that they thought would be helpful, we found quite clearly that they were favouring what we call informal help sources. So things like seeking help from family members, seeking help from religious leaders, over and above seeking help from mental health services. And we know obviously that this can be for a number of reasons. It can be because of structural barriers. The mental health services are not necessarily the best or best equipped to deal with the needs that they have. But we also know that mental health literacy, so personal beliefs or personal health beliefs and attitudes can impact that as well. So that then has led into a next series of research that I've been now involved in for the last, say, 5 years, where we kind of looked at, you know, starting off with adapting what's known as the mental health first aid program. So I was working with that mental health first aid who are based in Melbourne, and we took that program and adapted it so that it was, you know, developing the mental health skills of those who work with refugees, so improving their skills so they could accurately respond to people who were potentially maybe needing that help. And then we started, so more recently, doing some more localized programs where we were looking at improving the mental health literacy of community and spiritual leaders and the community themselves. So focusing in on, you know, increasing their understanding so that they were more accurately, you know, recognizing when a person was presenting with a mental illness, all the way through to trying to deal with mental illness related stigma, trying to reduce that, and, you know, effectively trying to improve their willingness and their engagement in mental health services. Of course, that's not necessarily an easy thing. There's been a lot of work looking and trying to shift mental illness stigma, and it's by far not an easy thing in general Australian populations or general Western populations. But we have demonstrated through, you know, this program that we can actually shift it. We can shift it in a way that is more favourable. People, when we were asking him questions around, you know, do you think this vignette, is this person the cause for their mental illness? You know, they were moving away from having that personalized blaming type approach to more, you know, favorable looking at things in a different way. So I'm going to stop here. I mean, I could talk a lot, but I could stop here, and I could and just direct you. This is my email address, but yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Shameran. And if you want to unshare your screen, let everyone see you. And if anyone has any questions, it's been such a full 3 papers that we've been able to listen to, and I've loved the way that Natalie's put everyone together, such a range of topics. So if anyone has any questions, pop them in the Q&A, both for Shameran, but also for Chi as well, as we, after a few minutes, we'll have a bit more of a broader group discussion. Shameran, I was wondering how access to community in the programs that you're trying to develop or explore, how important is, you know, potentially you being seen as maybe an insider in that community? How does that help or perhaps hinder what you're trying to do?
It absolutely is a vital part of you know, developing those kind of linkages. I mean, it can hinder depending on what you do and if you do it effectively, but I see it as an absolute fundamental. Just recently, we just finished another piece of research where we were actually looking at 3 communities. So we were looking at Arabic speaking, Mandarin speaking, and the Congolese. And if you look at the CIs, it's a representation of those 3 communities. I think if any work that you do in this field needs to have that, you know, I mean, you know, we're increasingly hearing about all of that type of consumer kind of led, you know, research and working with the community, and it is very much so.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I've got a question here for you from Al, who's asking about multi-generational trauma, and asking, for Assyrians in Australia, how is that trauma transmitted from one generation to the next?
Well, I can say to you, there is definitely stories told from parents to from grandparents to parents and so on. The events that happened in 2014 in North Iraq, where we were watching, because of all of the ability to watch it through social media and people showing, you know, we were actually watching people fleeing their homes, in some cases, you know, on foot, going up to more safer locations. And I remember sitting, talking to one of my aunties, and she was describing how her grandmother had explained a very similar situation when the Ottoman Empire, when the Ottoman kind of soldiers were attacking some of the villages, and they were forced to flee on foot. So the stories seem to be, you know, repeating in a sense in the community, some of those experiences. And when I was listening to it, my daughter was there listening to it. And so, you know, it continues to the importance of having these stories is so that we continue to recognize what has happened to the community and why they are presenting in the way they are. And so from my perspective as a therapist, what are the best ways that I can, you know, assist them so that they can somehow, you know, build the lives that they need to build to get on with things here.
And Kathleen has a question asking, do you have any plans to look at comparative mental health literacy between a variety of refugee or diasporic communities, and wondering how different cultures are reflected in the responses to related clusters of traumatic experience?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I did do a couple of papers where we were looking at a comparison between Iraqi refugees and Afghan refugees, and we were looking at some of the responses. Particularly, it was interesting where we were finding, after presenting the vignette, I mean, recognition was on par, but one of the things that which initially didn't really quite make sense to me, was that I was finding that the Iraqi refugees, for example, were saying, yes, we would seek help from religious leaders. And, you know, in the Iraqi refugee group, it was a kind of a mixture of both people from a Muslim background, but there are also Christians there. In the Afghan group, there were primarily Hazari refugees, and they were not indicating religious leaders as a source of help. So that didn't really initially make sense for me, but I had a PhD student who was from that background, and she was then followed up with a series of kind of qualitative interviews. It was quite clear from the experiences that they had had back home, where, you know, those religious leaders sometimes were the ones who were actually perpetrating some of the kind of experiences they had in terms of the Hazari minority group. But when they came here, they were really wanting to walk away from kind of, you know, seeking that help, not necessarily walk away from religion, because on a personal self-help way, they were still doing that, but they certainly didn't want to necessarily always reach out to the religious leaders. So yes, I think doing comparative research is going to be really interesting. And again, it can only happen when I have the right people to be able to do it. So it was great because I had a PhD student from that background. So I'm always keen to have people come in from different backgrounds. Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm going to invite Chi and perhaps Natalie to be part of this final few questions that we have. And I think probably a few people in our audience are oral historians and thinking about, you know, when we are talking through memories that may be traumatic. And Al's asking here, what are the ways in which sharing refugee histories and memories might help heal mental wounds or perhaps open those up in difficult ways? So maybe Shameran, if you want to take that question first.
Well, so the essence of a lot of psychotherapy is actually speaking and talking about your experiences. It needs to be, however, in a very supportive environment. And so absolutely sharing stories can be therapeutic and can assist, but it can in some cases, you know, do quite the opposite. So it very much depends on the person and what kind of environment they find themselves in, who they're sharing the story with, and what the response to those stories are, I guess, you know, very much influences those experiences.
And Chi, do you want to answer that question as well?
I guess from a writer, you know, a writing perspective, a creative writing perspective, it's if I am interviewing someone for either research or, you know, recently I've started interviewing bilinguals for a podcast. And it turns out that if you are unable to speak the language that, you know, your heritage is, then there's a lot of shame attached, and that's kind of consistent, you know, whether you're, you know, second generation, 1.5 generation, or, you know, one of the Indigenous artists I was having a pre kind of podcast conversation with also mentioned the idea of shame for not being, you know, in not being able to kind of speak your heritage language. And so I guess in that context, it would be a matter of making sure that the questions you ask are kind of supporting the person through that kind of journey, and then finding some way to leave them with a question that helps them find a positive perspective on what they've undergone. So you know, it's just about kind of being careful to not leave them in a scary negative moment in their memory, you know, like their account of what has happened.
And Natalie?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work in oral history, and there's that recognition of mental health and of mental health issues being a stigma also within the community. And working with second generation Vietnamese Australians, it's really interesting when the second generation, you know, really tries to understand the experiences of the first generation, and tries to understand that through this prism of mental health, which is a very difficult thing to do when it's not, you know, discussed openly, you know, within the community. Even the issue of trauma, you know, which in Vietnamese is like a spiritual wound. It's not something that was discussed openly within the community. It's only recently that within the Vietnamese community, you know, people have talked openly about the issue of trauma and trauma within families. So a lot of this trauma was associated with silence within the community, and people would know that something terrible had happened, but they would not necessarily know the full details of these events, you know, either, you know, what happened during the war or what happened during the refugee experience, or women being raped by pirates, for example. So I think the issue of being able to talk about certain events it sometimes helps when the person is close but not too close to the interviewee. When you're from the community, when you're from the same background, so there is a sense of familiarity, you understand what the person has been through, but you're not too close to them. So sometimes a little bit of distance does help in terms of the person confiding in another person, or in an oral historian, for example, in oral history interviews. But I'm very conscious of the fact that it's very delicate work, and it's also very difficult, when you're from the same community, to not lose yourself in the grief of the other person, because you identify with that grief, you understand it, and it's this very difficult work of trying to manage, that grief, and still, do your work still manage your work as a historian, in terms of, exploring memory and how people remember the past.
That's such a powerful image, Natalie, around that idea of losing yourself in the grief, and balancing that you have that connection with your interviewees or your patients or clients or colleagues, but you're also potentially more affected by it. Chi and Shameran, would you like to reflect on how you deal with that? That idea of losing yourself in grief or connecting too much that it's too hard to do your work?
Sorry, Chi, would you like me to?
I can continue with the podcast and then, yep. I think you need to not, so with the podcast I've been doing, I'm careful not to, lose myself in whatever the person is feeling. So if they might be feeling shame or confused, so you might get kind of conflicting feelings about something that they've attempted to do, and it's they feel conflicted as to whether they're been successful in kind of maintaining language for their children, etc. And so I think it's kind of, for me, it's about gently kind of pointing them to a door that allows them some freedom from being overwhelmed by grief. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's how I kind of picture what I'm trying to do in that moment, just to kind of through words paint a sense of there's a door here for you to, if you're stuck in this room of grief.
It's a little bit, I suppose, in some ways easier as therapists, because we have quite structured processes to make sure we deal effectively with this. So as a therapist, you need to be effective by having that empathy and understanding, but you have to have that distance so that you can see things in a way effectively. And so as psychologists, one of the absolute fundamentals of training is we are scientists, practitioners. So what that means is that while we are listening to the story, we're constantly thinking, what are they telling us? What are the presenting complaints? Or how is it impacting on them functionally? And then coming back to them and saying, okay, here is a way that we can deal with this using some appropriate psychological theory. So often in Australia and the UK, we are very much influenced by cognitive behavioural therapy. So presenting it back and using that theoretical framework to to deal with the trauma and the grief allows you to keep that kind of effective, I wouldn't say distance, I wouldn't say boundary, but the ability not to lose yourself, I guess, in the grief, you know, to consistently. And the other thing is we are required to do clinical supervision. So that is a very, I mean, that's every year we need to document a minimum of, I think it's 10 hours of individual peer-to-peer supervision. Often, I think it's about, you can do 10 minimum and more than that. And so that is for these reasons. So regardless of working with your own community, often you can lose yourself in grief when you're working in this kind of trauma space. So,
yeah. Thank you for that insight, and to all of you for answering these questions. And now, as we head to the end of our event, I'm going to hand over to Natalie.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. And thank you to our speakers, Ruth Balint, Chiru, and Shameran Slewa-Younan. And thank you so much, Alicia, for handling all the Q&As. We would also like to thank our sponsors, Monash University Publishing, for the gifts for our speakers. And I'd like to thank again, you know, the Making Public Histories team, you know, Al Thompson, who was here today, as well as Margie and Susie for being here. Thank you all for your attendance at these Making Public History seminar series and your interest and participation in the series throughout 2022. And we would like to invite you to join us all in 2023. Thank you, everyone.